Thek's claws scraped against the metal table as he tried to steady his hands. The sound echoed through the quiet chamber where 5 beings from different worlds sat watching him. His yellow eyes darted between their faces, searching for something he could not name. Understanding, perhaps. Or maybe just the courage to speak the words that had haunted him for 3 months. The room smelled of recycled air and fear. Not his fear alone, but the collective unease of everyone present. They had all heard stories about the war. They had seen the casualty reports. But none of them had stood on New Terra when the humans first showed what they were truly capable of. Vel, the Altarian peacekeeper, leaned forward in her chair. Her blue skin seemed to glow under the harsh lights. "Commander Thek, you may begin when you are ready." Thek looked down at his hands. Once they had been steady enough to pilot a fighter ship through an asteroid field. Now they shook like leaves in a storm. The war had ended, but it lived on in every twitch of his muscles, every racing beat of his heart. "I was proud once," he said quietly. "We all were." The Krill hegemony had never lost a war. In 300 cycles of expansion, we had conquered 47 worlds. We knew how to break a species. We understood fear, desperation, surrender. We thought we understood everything. He raised his head and met Vel's gaze. We were wrong about the humans. We were wrong about everything. The first mistake had been thinking humans were like the other species they had conquered. When the hegemony's war council studied Earth, they saw a divided planet. Humans fought among themselves constantly. Their technology was primitive compared to Krill standards. Their military tactics seemed random and inefficient. The council had laughed when they planned the invasion. New Terra was supposed to be easy, Thek continued. A simple farming colony with maybe 10,000 humans. No major defenses. No military installations. Our intelligence said it would take 6 hours to secure the planet. We brought 3 battalions because High Command thought one might not be enough for a proper show of force. The irony still burned in his throat. 3 battalions, 9,000 of the hegemony's finest warriors against 10,000 farmers and their families. It should have been a massacre. In a way it was. Thek remembered the moment their ships broke through the atmosphere. New Terra stretched below them like a green jewel, dotted with small settlements and vast fields of grain. Children played in the streets. Adults worked in their gardens. It looked peaceful. Normal. Nothing like the fortress worlds the Krill usually had to storm. We sent the surrender demand as protocol required, Thek said. 1 hour to lay down arms and prepare for processing. Standard procedure. We had done it 47 times before. The humans had responded within minutes, not with surrender, not with pleading or threats. They had sent back a simple message. Come and take it. Thek's battalion had landed in the main settlement of Riverside. He had expected to find humans cowering in their homes or fleeing into the wilderness. Instead, the streets were empty except for one figure standing in the town square. It was a human female, maybe 40 cycles old by their aging standards. She wore simple farming clothes and held a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum. When Thek approached with his honor guard, she did not run. She did not drop her weapon. She simply stood there and smiled. "My name is Colonel Reed," she had said. "I guess you're here for the war." That was when Thek realized something was wrong. This human knew they were coming. More than that, she had been waiting for them. As if she had been planning for this moment her entire life. "You call yourself Colonel?" Thek had asked. "I see no army." Reed's smile had grown wider. "Look again." That was when the shooting started. Not from Reed, but from everywhere else. Every window, every rooftop, every doorway erupted with gunfire. Humans appeared from hiding spots that should not have been possible to conceal. They fired weapons that should not have worked against Krill armor, and they did it all with the same calm smile that Reed wore. Thek's honor guard died in the first 30 seconds. Trained warriors who had fought in a dozen campaigns, cut down by farmers with hunting rifles and homemade explosives. Thek himself only survived because a human child, no more than 12 cycles old, chose to reload instead of shooting when she had a clear shot at his head. "We had better armor," Thek told the tribunal. "Better weapons. Better training. But they had something we did not understand. They had chosen to fight before we ever arrived. Not just the soldiers. Everyone. The whole planet had become one weapon pointed at us. The battle for Riverside lasted 18 hours. By the end, 2/3 of Thek's battalion was dead or wounded. They had managed to secure 3 buildings. 3 buildings out of an entire town, and the humans were still smiling. Thek learned later that Reed had indeed been a colonel, but not in any army the Krill intelligence knew about. She had been a teacher before the war, but when the humans learned the hegemony was coming, every adult on New Terra had been given military training, not just basic combat skills, but advanced tactics, psychological warfare, and something the humans called asymmetric resistance theory. They had spent 2 years preparing for a war that lasted 6 hours on every other world the Krill had conquered. On New Terra, it lasted 6 months. The worst part, Thek said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, was that they were enjoying it. Every human we fought seemed genuinely happy to be there. Like this was what they had been born to do. Vel shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Commander, are you saying the humans showed signs of battle madness? Many species experience psychological breaks during extreme combat. Thek shook his head slowly. No, they were not mad. That would have been easier to understand. They were completely sane, completely rational. They had simply decided that killing us was more important than staying alive themselves. And they were very, very good at it. The silence in the room stretched until it became painful. Finally, Thek spoke again. That was just the first day. Dust swirled through the air as Thek shifted his weight in the tribunal chair. The memory of Crimson Valley made his skin crawl even now, months after the nightmare had ended. He could still smell the smoke and hear the sounds that no warrior should ever have to hear. Tell us about the siege, Vel prompted gently. Her voice carried the practiced calm of someone who had listened to many horrible stories. Thek closed his eyes. Sometimes that made it easier to speak. Sometimes it made the memories worse. Today he could not tell which it would be. Crimson Valley had been the humans' main military outpost on New Terra. Unlike the scattered settlements his forces had struggled to capture, this was a proper fortress. Walls, weapons, trained soldiers. It should have been a conventional battle, something the Krill understood. We surrounded them completely, Thek said. No way in or out. Our bombardment ships cut off all supply lines. By every military calculation in the Galactic Assembly database, they should have lasted maybe 10 days, 15 if they rationed everything perfectly. The fortress held for 6 weeks. Thek opened his eyes and stared at the wall behind the tribunal. On it hung the flags of a dozen worlds, all members of the Galactic Assembly, all species that followed the established rules of war. Rules that made sense. Rules that kept conflicts from becoming too costly for either side. The humans had never signed those agreements. Their commander was a man named Reed, Thek continued. Not related to the colonel from Riverside, though they shared the same strange human determination. Lieutenant Colonel Reed had maybe 400 soldiers under his command. We had 3,000 surrounding him. The mathematics had been simple. The Krill would pound the fortress with artillery until the walls cracked. Then they would storm the breach with overwhelming numbers. The humans would surrender or die. It was how every siege in galactic history had ended. But Reed had done something no commander in recorded history had ever attempted. He had convinced his soldiers they were winning. On the first day we destroyed their outer wall, Thek said. Reed broadcast a message to his troops over their communication system. We intercepted it, of course. He told them that the Krill had wasted ammunition on empty stone, that every shell we fired made us weaker. His soldiers actually cheered. Thek remembered the sound of that cheering. It had echoed across the valley like thunder. His own warriors had looked at each other with confusion. Humans were not supposed to cheer when their defenses fell. On the 10th day, we breached their inner courtyard. Reed told his people we had triggered their trap, that we were exactly where they wanted us, and somehow he was right. The humans had turned their own fortress into a maze of death. Every room was a trap. Every corridor was a killing ground. They had spent years preparing for this exact siege, even though they could not have known when or if it would come. They fought like they could see the future, but it was not their tactics that haunted Thek. It was their attitude. I watched a human soldier lose his left arm to shrapnel, Thek said quietly. A piece of our artillery shell nearly cut it off at the shoulder. He picked up the arm, looked at it for a moment, then used it to beat one of my warriors to death before he bled out. He was laughing the entire time. The tribunal members exchanged glances. Thek could see the disbelief in their faces. He understood. He would not have believed it either if someone else had told him the story. Their medics were the worst, he continued. We shot at them constantly, as is proper in siege warfare. Medical personnel are legitimate targets when they treat enemy soldiers. But these humans would not take cover. They would crawl through gunfire to reach wounded soldiers. They would perform surgery while artillery shells exploded around them. We killed dozens of their medics, but more kept coming. Thek paused, remembering one medic in particular. A young woman named Davis who had worked for 3 days straight without sleep. She had saved 17 human soldiers while under constant fire. When a Krill sniper finally killed her, she was in the middle of removing shrapnel from a wounded man's chest. Her last act was to hand her surgical tools to a nearby soldier and whisper instructions for finishing the operation. The soldier had completed the surgery successfully. He had no medical training. By the 3rd week, we were losing more warriors than they were, Thek admitted. This was not supposed to be possible. They had no supplies, no reinforcements, no hope of victory. But every day, Reed would broadcast another message telling his people about their latest success. Thek had listened to every one of those broadcasts. Reed spoke like a teacher explaining a lesson to slow students. He would describe how each Krill attack had played into human hands, how every loss was actually a gain, how the siege was proceeding exactly according to plan. The terrifying thing was that Reed seemed to believe every word he said. On day 38, we broke through to their command center, Thek said. Reed was there, of course. He had been shot 4 times and had not eaten in days, but he was still standing, still smiling. Do you know what he said to me? Vel leaned forward. What? He said right on schedule, and then he pressed a button. The explosion had brought down the entire fortress. Not just the building Reed was in, but every structure in the complex. The humans had rigged their own base with enough explosives to create a crater visible from orbit. They had waited 6 weeks to use them. Waited until the maximum number of Krill forces were inside the walls. Thek had survived only because he had been standing near a doorway when the blast hit. Most of his assault team had not been so lucky. In one moment, Reed had eliminated over 800 Krill warriors, the largest single loss in hegemony military history. But that was not the worst part, Thek said, his voice barely audible now. The worst part was what we found in the rubble. The recovery teams had worked for days to dig through the collapsed fortress. They found bodies, weapons, supplies, and they found Reed's personal quarters, somehow intact in the center of the devastation. On his desk was a calendar. Every day of the siege had been marked with a small notation. Day 1, enemy arrives on schedule. Day 15, morale holding as expected. Day 38, phase 1 complete. He had planned the entire siege, Thek said. Every day, every battle, every loss. It was all part of some larger strategy that we could not see. The humans had not been trying to hold the fortress. They had been trying to kill as many of us as possible before they died. Thek looked directly at Vel. That was when I realized we were not fighting soldiers. We were fighting something else. Something that thought about war in ways we could not understand. The tribunal sat in stunned silence. Finally, one of the other members, a Zenthari diplomat named Cole, spoke up. Commander, you are saying the humans deliberately sacrificed their own fortress and everyone in it. Yes. For what purpose? Thek's claws scraped the table again. To teach us fear. Rain drummed against the windows of the tribunal chamber as Thek struggled to find words for what came next. Some memories were harder to speak than others. Some truths were too dark to share easily, even when sharing them was necessary. The Altarian peacekeeper waited patiently. She had learned not to rush him. The worst stories took time to tell properly. After Crimson Valley, High Command sent reinforcements, Thek began. They thought we were simply outnumbered. They did not understand that numbers meant nothing to humans. They could not understand what the humans were doing to themselves. Thek had discovered it by accident. 3 weeks after the fortress fell, his scouts captured a human patrol. Standard procedure was to interrogate prisoners for intelligence about enemy positions and plans. What they found instead was something that defied every rule of warfare the Krill had ever learned. The human soldiers they captured showed no fear. This was not unusual. Many species trained their warriors to resist interrogation, but these humans went beyond fearlessness. They seemed genuinely curious about their captors, asking questions about Krill culture and military structure, as if being captured was just another learning opportunity. The first prisoner was a captain named Morris, Thek said. We learned later that her entire family had died in our initial bombardment. Her spouse, her children, everyone she had ever loved. This should have made her desperate for revenge or broken with grief. Instead, she seemed almost peaceful. Morris had answered their questions readily. She told them about human defensive positions, supply routes, even planned operations. The intelligence was so valuable that Thek had begun to think they had finally found a human weakness. Then Morris had explained what she was really doing. She told us that every piece of information she gave us was carefully selected, Thek continued. Some of it was true but useless. Some of it was false but believable. Some of it was true and valuable, but would lead us into traps. She said she had spent weeks memorizing exactly what to tell us if she was captured. Morris had looked directly at Thek during this explanation. Her eyes were calm, almost friendly. She spoke like a teacher helping a student understand a difficult concept. The humans had something they called death meditation. Thek said, before every mission, they would spend time preparing their minds for the possibility that they would not return. Not just accepting death, but embracing it, making it part of their strategy. The tribunal members shifted uncomfortably. Vel made a note on her tablet, but her expression showed she was struggling to process what she was hearing. Morris had been the first human to explain the concept to them. Humans, she said, were naturally afraid of dying. This fear made them weak and unpredictable in combat, so they had developed techniques to remove that fear entirely. They would sit quietly and imagine their own death in detail, Thek continued, every possible way they might die in the coming battle. They would picture their bodies broken and bleeding. They would imagine the pain, the fear, the moment when life ended, and they would do this until the images no longer frightened them. But death meditation went beyond simple mental preparation. The humans used it to fundamentally change how they approached warfare. A soldier who truly accepted death could take risks that no rational being would consider. They could walk into certain death if it meant completing their mission. They could endure torture without breaking because physical pain meant nothing, compared to the peace they had found in accepting their own mortality. Morris demonstrated this for us, Thek said quietly. She asked if we wanted to see how death meditation worked. When we agreed, she bit through her own tongue and bled to death rather than give us any more information. She did it without showing any signs of pain or fear. She died smiling. The memory still made Thek's hands shake. He had watched beings die in combat before. He had killed enemies himself, but he had never seen someone choose death with such casual ease. After Morris died, Thek's forces captured more human soldiers. Each one had undergone the same training. Each one was prepared to die at any moment for any reason. It made them impossible to interrogate using conventional methods. Worse, it made them impossible to predict in battle. A soldier who does not fear death fights differently, Thek explained. They take risks that should not work. They volunteer for missions that have no chance of success, and somehow, because they do not expect to survive, they often do survive. Thek told the tribunal about a human named Williams who had volunteered to destroy a krill supply depot. The mission was clearly impossible. The depot was heavily guarded and located deep behind enemy lines. Williams would have to cross 50 kilometers of hostile territory alone, penetrate the defenses, plant explosives, and escape. No rational being would attempt it. Williams had succeeded. He told us later that death meditation made it easy, Thek said. Since he expected to die anyway, he could focus entirely on the mission. He did not waste mental energy worrying about survival. He just did what needed to be done. But the humans had developed other techniques that were even more disturbing. Thek's intelligence officers had eventually captured a human scientist named Dr. Lane. Unlike the soldiers, Lane seemed eager to talk. She explained that humans were naturally curious creatures. When they encountered something they did not understand, they studied it until they did understand. The humans had been studying the krill. Dr. Lane had spent months analyzing our behavior patterns, Thek said. She knew how krill warriors thought, how we made decisions, what we feared. She had developed psychological weapons specifically designed to break our minds. Lane had shown them recordings of krill prisoners responding to various stimuli, sounds that triggered panic responses, images that caused disorientation, words spoken in exactly the right tone to bypass rational thought and create overwhelming fear. She had tested all of these techniques on herself first, Thek continued. She deliberately exposed herself to psychological torture to understand how it worked. Then she designed better methods to use against us. The tribunal was silent. Vel had stopped taking notes. Her blue skin had gone pale. Lane had died 3 days after demonstrating her research. Not from torture or execution, but from the effects of her own experiments. She had damaged her mind so severely in the process of learning to damage others that her body simply shut down. Her last words had been a request for her research notes to be given to other human scientists so they could continue her work. That was when we began to understand what we were fighting, Thek said. The humans were not just willing to die for victory. They were willing to become monsters for victory. They were transforming themselves into something that could defeat us, regardless of what it cost them. Thek looked around the room at the faces of the tribunal members. He could see the fear in their eyes now, the same fear he had lived with for months. And they were very good at it. Cold air circulated through the tribunal chamber as Thek sat motionless in his chair. Outside, the space station rotated slowly, bringing different stars into view through the thick windows. None of them were Sul. Thek had specifically requested that Earth not be visible during his testimony. Some things were too difficult to face while speaking about them. What happened next changed everything, Thek said finally. Not just the war, but how we understood the nature of intelligence itself. The Xanthari diplomat, Cole, leaned forward. His scaled face showed the same fascination and horror that had become common in the room. What did the humans do? Thek's claws tapped against the table in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Fast and irregular, they stopped being human. The change had been gradual at first. Small things that were easy to miss if you were not looking for them. Human prisoners who spoke differently than before. Resistance fighters who used tactics that seemed to come from nowhere. Scientists who developed weapons using principles that should not have worked. Dr. Lane was not the only one conducting experiments. Thek continued. Every human settlement had become a research facility. They were studying themselves as intensively as they studied us, trying to understand what parts of their nature helped them fight and what parts held them back. The first sign that something fundamental had changed came during the siege of the industrial complex on New Terra's northern continent. Thek's forces had surrounded a weapons factory, where humans were producing ammunition for their resistance fighters. Standard protocol was to cut off supplies and wait for the defenders to run out of materials. Instead, the humans had started using their own bodies as raw materials. A scientist named Dr. Walsh had discovered that human blood contains iron, Thek said. Not much, but enough to use in manufacturing if you had the right extraction techniques. The humans began donating blood not just for medical purposes but for weapons production. This had seemed like desperation at first, a sign that the humans were finally running out of resources. Thek's commanders had been pleased. Desperate enemies made mistakes, but the humans were not desperate. They were adapting. Dr. Walsh did not stop with blood, Thek continued. She began experimenting with other biological materials. Bone calcium for explosives, nervous tissue for biocomputers, hair and skin for composite materials. She was turning her own species into a resource to be harvested. The tribunal members looked sick. Vel had pushed her tablet away and was gripping the edge of the table with both hands. The most disturbing part was that the other humans supported her research. Thek said, they volunteered for her experiments. Parents offered their children. Children offered themselves. Everyone understood that this was necessary for victory. Dr. Walsh had eventually created a bioweapon, using her own modified DNA as the base component. The weapon could target krill genetic markers while leaving humans unaffected. It was a brilliant piece of science that represented years of theoretical research compressed into months of desperate experimentation. She had tested it on herself first, naturally. The process killed her, but not before she confirmed that it worked. Her assistants had continued the research using her corpse as additional raw material. We found her laboratory after we overran the facility, Thek said. The other humans had preserved her body and chemicals and were systematically harvesting organs for continued research. They spoke about her like she was still alive and working with them. But Dr. Walsh's sacrifice was not unique. As the war progressed, Thek encountered more and more humans who had voluntarily transformed themselves into weapons. There was Engineer Park, who had replaced his own limbs with mechanical devices that could interface directly with human technology. He could operate complex machinery using thought alone, making him far more efficient than any normal human engineer. There was Pilot Cruz, who had undergone surgery to modify her nervous system for faster reaction times. The procedure had a 90% fatality rate, but Cruz had survived and could now pilot aircraft with superhuman precision. There was Soldier Green, who had volunteered for experimental drug treatments that increased his strength and speed at the cost of his long-term health. He would die within a year from the side effects, but he could now fight at nearly Krill levels of physical capability. Every human settlement had people like this, Thek said, volunteers who had given up parts of their humanity to become better weapons. And somehow their society continued to function normally around them. The strangest part was how other humans treated these volunteers. They were not seen as victims or martyrs. They were treated like heroes who had found better ways to serve their communities. Children would ask them for autographs. Adults would invite them to dinner. They remained integrated into human society, even after becoming something that was no longer entirely human. We captured a human child during one of our raids, Thek continued. She could not have been more than 12 cycles old. When we searched her belongings, we found drawings she had made. Pictures of herself with mechanical arms or modified eyes or chemical-enhanced muscles. She was planning her own transformation. The child, whose name was Robin, had explained her drawings with the same enthusiasm that other children might show for toys or games. She wanted to be useful to her community. She had studied the various modifications available and decided that enhanced hearing would be most valuable for a scout. She was already practicing meditation techniques to prepare for the surgery. This child was not afraid, Thek said. She was excited. She saw becoming a weapon as the most natural thing in the world. Her parents supported her decision completely. Thek paused, remembering Robin's bright smile as she explained her plans. She had died 3 days later when a Krill artillery shell hit the building where she was being held. But her drawings had haunted him ever since. The humans were not just willing to sacrifice their lives for victory. They were willing to sacrifice their species' identity. They were becoming something new, something designed specifically to destroy the Krill Empire. By the end of the war on New Terra, we estimated that 40% of the human population had undergone some form of voluntary modification, Thek said. They had created an entire generation of beings that were partially human and partially weapons. Vel finally spoke, her voice hoarse. What happened to them after the war ended? Thek met her eyes. They kept the modifications. All of them. When we signed the peace treaty, the human negotiators made it clear that the changes were permanent. They had no intention of returning to their original form. The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the horror being discussed within the tribunal chamber. That was when I understood why no species had ever successfully conquered humanity, Thek said quietly. It was not because they were too strong or too smart or too numerous. It was because they were willing to stop being human in order to win, and they were very, very good at it. Shadows moved across the tribunal chamber as the space station continued its rotation. Thek watched them crawl along the walls like living things, dark and restless. He understood those shadows now. They reminded him of the humans he had fought. Always moving, always changing, always becoming something different than what they had been before. New Geneva was supposed to be our final victory, Thek said, his voice barely above a whisper. The last human stronghold on New Terra. High Command had promised that once we took the city, the planet would surrender. The war would be over. Vel shifted in her seat. She had been taking notes again, but her writing was shaky now. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her stylus. What made New Geneva different from the other battles? Thek closed his eyes and tried to find the right words. How could he explain what he had seen there? How could he make them understand the moment when he realized that the humans had been planning everything from the very beginning? General Hayes was in command of the city, Thek began. We had studied him for months. His tactical record, his psychological profile, his personal history. According to our analysis, he was a competent but unremarkable commander, someone who would fight hard but follow conventional military doctrine. The siege of New Geneva had begun like every other battle of the war. Krill forces surrounded the city and demanded surrender. The humans refused. Artillery bombardments began. The humans took cover and returned fire. Everything proceeded according to established patterns. For 6 months we hammered their defenses, Thek continued. We destroyed their outer walls, their weapon emplacements, their supply depots. Every day our intelligence reported that human resistance was weakening. Every day Hayes broadcast messages asking his people to hold on just a little longer. Thek opened his eyes and stared at the wall. The memory of those months still felt like a weight on his chest. His forces had been winning. Every metric confirmed it. Human casualties were mounting. Their ammunition was running low. Their defensive positions were crumbling. On the final day we breached the inner city, Thek said. My warriors poured through gaps in their walls like water through a broken dam. We expected to find humans huddled in their shelters waiting for the end. Instead, we found empty streets. The silence of New Geneva had been more terrifying than any battle cry. Thek's soldiers had advanced through neighborhoods where no humans could be seen, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every window seemed to hide eyes. Every shadow seemed to move. Hayes met us in the city center, Thek continued. He was standing alone in the middle of the main square wearing his dress uniform. No weapons, no guards, no defenses. Just standing there like he was waiting for a parade to begin. General Hayes had been exactly as their intelligence files described him. Average height for a human, graying hair, unremarkable features. He could have been any aging soldier from any army in the galaxy. Nothing about him suggested the tactical genius that Thek was about to encounter. I approached him with my full honor guard, Thek said. 50 of our finest warriors in battle armor, weapons ready. Hayes did not seem impressed. He checked his timepiece and nodded, like we had arrived exactly when he expected us to. Hayes had smiled when Thek demanded his surrender, not the desperate grin of someone who had accepted defeat, but the satisfied smile of someone whose plan was working perfectly. He said we were exactly on schedule, Thek continued. Then he asked if we wanted to see what 6 months of preparation looked like. That was when Thek noticed the wires. They were everywhere, so thin and well hidden that his warriors had walked past them without seeing them. They ran along the buildings, under the streets, through the sewers. The entire city had been rigged with enough explosives to level everything within the walls. Hayes had turned New Geneva into a weapon, Thek said. Not just the buildings, but the streets, the utilities, even the decorative statues in the parks. Everything was designed to channel our forces into specific areas and then eliminate us. But the explosives were not the worst part. The worst part was realizing that the siege itself had been part of Hayes's plan. He had never intended to hold the city, Thek continued. The 6 months of fighting, the gradual retreat, the desperate radio broadcasts, all of it was theater. He was drawing us in, making us think we were winning, positioning us exactly where he wanted us. Hayes had explained this while Thek's warriors frantically tried to retreat from the trapped city. His voice was calm and educational, like a professor giving a lecture to interested students. The human evacuation had not been a panicked flight from the advancing Krill forces. It had been a carefully planned redeployment. While Thek's army had focused on breaking through the defenses, Hayes had been moving his civilian population to hidden positions throughout the surrounding countryside. 20,000 humans had vanished from our sensors, Thek said. We thought they had fled the planet or died in the bombardments. They had actually been moving into position to operate the trap that Hayes had built. The civilians were not just hiding, they were waiting. Every man, woman, and child had been given a specific role in the coming battle. They knew exactly when and where the Krill forces would be when Hayes gave the signal. The children were operating the detonators, Thek said quietly. Hayes had trained them for months, teaching them to recognize different types of Krill vehicles and formation patterns. When they saw the right targets in the right positions, they would trigger their assigned explosives. Thek remembered seeing them through his scope as he tried to lead his remaining warriors to safety. Human children, some no older than 8 cycles, sitting calmly at hidden control panels. They looked like they were playing an elaborate game. Hayes activated the first sequence while I was still talking to him, Thek continued. The building we were standing in front of collapsed inward, creating a funnel that directed the debris into the street where most of my honor guard was positioned. 30 warriors died in the first 10 seconds, but Hayes was not finished. As Thek's forces tried to regroup and escape the city, they discovered that every exit route had been prepared as well. The humans had spent months studying Krill tactical doctrine, learning exactly how his species would respond to different types of threats. They knew we would try to retreat to the eastern gate, Thek said. They knew we would form defensive formations to protect our wounded. They knew we would attempt to call for orbital support. They had planned for everything. The battle for New Geneva lasted 4 hours. When it ended, 3,000 Krill warriors were dead. Hayes's casualties numbered exactly 1. He killed himself to trigger the final sequence, Thek said. The device required a living human to activate it, and Hayes was the only one still inside the city. He looked directly at me and smiled before he pressed the button. The explosion had brought down the central administrative building, creating an avalanche of concrete and steel that blocked the remaining exit routes. Thek had survived only because Hayes had apparently wanted at least one Krill warrior to escape and tell the story. I found a note in my armor afterward, Thek continued. Hayes had somehow placed it there during our conversation. It contained a complete tactical analysis of the battle, written from the Krill perspective. He had understood our strategy better than we did. The note had been signed with a simple message. Thank you for participating in our training exercise. Vel had gone completely pale. Her stylus had fallen from her hand and lay forgotten on the table. Training exercise? Thek nodded slowly. The entire siege had been a test of human defensive capabilities. Hayes had used our army to evaluate his tactics and train his people. 3,000 Krill warriors had died, so that humans could learn how to fight us more effectively. The silence in the room was broken only by the soft hum of the station's life support systems. Outside, the stars continued their eternal dance, but they seemed dimmer now. That was when I understood what we were really fighting, Thek said. Not soldiers. Not even warriors. We were fighting a species that could turn any defeat into a learning opportunity, and any victory into a trap. They were always thinking 3 steps ahead of us. Thek looked directly at each tribunal member in turn, and they were just getting started. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power systems cycled through their daily maintenance routine. The harsh red glow transformed the tribunal chamber into something that resembled the bridge of a warship. Thek found this appropriate. What he was about to tell them was a story of war in its purest and most terrible form. The final battle never happened, Thek said into the crimson-tinged silence. That is the most important thing for you to understand. Humanity won the war by making victory impossible for anyone. Cole, the Zenthari diplomat, leaned forward. His scales caught the emergency lighting and threw it back in patterns that hurt to look at. How does one make victory impossible? Thek's claws scraped against the table one final time. After today, he would never have to tell this story again. The thought should have been comforting, but it only made him feel hollow. By ensuring that winning would cost more than losing, Thek said. The humans had spent 3 years of war learning everything they could about us. Our psychology, our culture, our technology, but most importantly, they learned our limits. After New Geneva, the Krill hegemony had been forced to acknowledge that conquering New Terra would require a complete change in strategy. The humans had proven that conventional warfare was useless against an enemy willing to transform their entire civilization into a weapon. High Command had made the decision to escalate. If the humans wanted total war, they would get it. Admiral Kren ordered the fleet to Earth's moon, Thek continued. 50,000 warriors, 200 ships, enough firepower to reduce the human homeworld to asteroid fragments. The plan was simple. Demonstrate that resistance was futile by destroying something humans could not afford to lose. The human response had been immediate and unexpected. Instead of scrambling to defend their homeworld, they had sent a single ambassador to meet with Admiral Kren, a middle-aged woman named Cross who arrived in an unarmed shuttle. Ambassador Cross came aboard our flagship alone, Thek said. No guards, no weapons, no defensive equipment. She was completely vulnerable, surrounded by 50,000 beings who wanted to kill her, and she acted like she was attending a business meeting. Cross had requested a formal audience with Admiral Kren and his senior staff. She had important information to share, she said. Information that would affect the hegemony's decision about how to proceed with the war. Kren had agreed to listen, more from curiosity than respect. What could one human possibly say that would matter to the most powerful military force in the galaxy? Cross began with a simple question, Thek continued. She asked Admiral Kren what he knew about human voting procedures. The question had seemed absurd. What did civilian political processes matter during total war? But Cross had insisted that the answer was vital to understanding what would happen next. She explained that when humans faced extinction-level threats, they used a specific type of democratic vote. Every adult member of the species was allowed to participate. The decision required unanimous agreement. If even one human disagreed, the vote failed. Cross told us that humanity had voted on the war. Thek said, every human in the galaxy had been asked the same question. Would they rather live as slaves or die as free beings? The vote had been held 3 days before Cross arrived at the Krill fleet. 47 billion humans had participated. The result had been unanimous. Death over slavery. Freedom or extinction, no exceptions. Cross had brought the voting records with her, Tech continued. She showed us the results from every human world, every space station, every colony ship. Even human children as young as 12 cycles had been allowed to vote. Every single one had chosen death. But the vote was not just a symbolic gesture. It was authorization for something humans called the Final Protocol. Cross explained that humans had been preparing for this possibility since their first contact with alien species. Tech said, they had always known that someday they might encounter a threat they could not defeat through conventional means. The Final Protocol was humanity's solution to the problem of inevitable defeat. If they could not win, they would ensure that victory was meaningless for their enemies. Cross had brought technical specifications with her, detailed plans for devices that could destabilize the nuclear structure of entire planets, weapons that could trigger stellar collapse, technologies that could render solar systems uninhabitable for millions of years. They had built them, Tech said quietly. Over the course of the war, while we were focused on military targets, humans had been constructing the infrastructure for species-wide suicide. Every human world was rigged with planet killers. Every major population center had antimatter devices that could create explosions visible from neighboring star systems. Every space habitat was equipped with drives that could accelerate them into nearby stars. But that was not the worst part, Tech continued. The worst part was what they had built around non-human worlds. Humanity had spent decades studying the orbital mechanics of every inhabited system in the galaxy. They had identified planets whose destruction would trigger cascade effects, worlds whose loss would destabilize entire regions of space. They had positioned weapons around 47 of these systems. Cross showed us the targeting data, Tech said. If humanity activated the Final Protocol, they would not just kill themselves. They would take 200 billion innocent beings with them. Entire species would go extinct just because they happened to live near strategically important worlds. Admiral Kren had demanded to know why humans would threaten innocent species who had never attacked them. Cross had explained with the same calm patience she had shown throughout the meeting. Humans were not naturally evil, she said. But they were naturally social creatures who formed emotional bonds with their families and communities. When those bonds were threatened, they would do anything to protect them. Anything at all. Cross told us that humans loved their children more than they loved their own lives, Tech continued. They loved their freedom more than they loved the rest of the galaxy, and they had voted to prove it. The Final Protocol devices were already armed and waiting for activation codes. Those codes were held by a committee of 7 humans on Earth. If the committee lost contact with human settlements for more than 72 hours, the devices would activate automatically. Cross gave us a choice, Tech said. We could continue the war and watch our enemies commit suicide while taking half the galaxy with them. Or we could negotiate a peace treaty that would allow both species to survive. Admiral Kren had asked what guarantees humanity could offer that they would not use the Final Protocol as a permanent threat against other species. Cross had smiled and provided an answer that still haunted Tech's dreams. She said that humans were not interested in conquest or domination, Tech continued. They just wanted to be left alone. As long as no one tried to enslave or exterminate them, the Final Protocol would remain dormant. But if any species ever threatened human extinction again, the vote was already in place. The next time there would be no negotiation. The tribunal chamber was completely silent now. Even the normal sounds of the station seemed muted, as if the mechanical systems were afraid to interrupt. Admiral Kren called off the attack, Tech said. Not because we could not win, but because we finally understood what winning meant. Humanity would rather destroy the galaxy than submit to conquest. Cross had left the same way she arrived, alone, unarmed, completely vulnerable. But now everyone understood that her vulnerability was an illusion. She carried the collective will of an entire species that had voted for mutual extinction rather than surrender. The peace treaty was signed 1 week later. Tech continued. Humanity kept all their territory. The hegemony agreed to pay reparations for the invasion, and everyone pretended that the Final Protocol devices did not exist. Tech looked around the room at the faces of the tribunal members. He could see his own fear reflected in their eyes. That is why the war ended, he said. Not because humanity was defeated or because the Krill hegemony showed mercy. It ended because we finally understood what we were fighting. We were fighting a species that had weaponized its own extinction. A species that loved freedom more than life itself. Vel found her voice first. Are the devices still active? Tech met her gaze and held it. What do you think? The emergency lighting switched off as the main power systems came back online. Normal illumination returned to the tribunal chamber, but somehow the room felt darker than before. The humans taught us something that day, Tech said in the growing silence. They taught us that there are some victories that cost too much to achieve. Some enemies who defeat you by refusing to be defeated. He stood slowly, his joints aching from hours of sitting in the same position. They taught us fear, he said quietly, and we were very good students.